the last panel leads us beautifully into the conversation we're about to have. But also how the archive makes things complex. And that maybe the complexity of it is in part the frustration, but also the joy. So I want to begin with Glenn. And Glenn Phillips is there, and I want to begin with Glenn. I hope all of you will enjoy the wonderful booklet that the side team put together. There's some wonderful essays in it that have been great inspiration for me. And I'm going to read, at the risk of embarrassing him, one of Glenn's comments, which I very much like. And then, because I'm a quotomaniac by profession, I am going to offer you a quotation and ask Glenn to respond to it. This came to me at 2 a.m. last night, or this morning. So let's see if it works. Lisa has heard it and didn't think it was terrible. So, here is what Glenn wrote for the booklet, which you all should really both take home and read carefully. This is in relation to this whole notion of the archive and the perfect life. We comfort ourselves by thinking that archives have a solid connection to truth, when in fact they are a representational medium that can be just as partial and deceptive as any other. Some people scrub their archives of any trace of rejection, leaving behind the picture of a career of continual and easy success. Others want every scrap of struggle front and center, a reminder of how hard things were. And now this passage I adore. I asked an artist about a period when their archives contained very little, and they said, it's because I was so happy then. I asked another artist about a similar period, and they said, it's because I was so sad. Looking through decades of correspondence, I asked about what I could only assume was a close friendship. God, I hate that bitch. She'd never leave me alone. Someone confessed to me that they lied to their diary. Archives do guide us to a sort of truth, but it's a truth that more closely resembles a portrait than an evidentiary truth contained on any given page. Alongside our discoveries in the archive, we should also try to keep the absences in mind. What is not there, and who? What did not survive, and who? Even if the only thing we can do is, alongside the things we know, imagine an absence of which we know nothing. This might still construct a better picture of the past than the one that relies wholly on archival evidence. Now, after I read that, this came to my mind. So Glenn, I'd like you to listen to it, everybody to listen to it, but for you to react to it, and of course the panel as a whole might have things to contribute to it. So at 2 a.m., naturally, George Orwell came into my mind. And George Orwell wrote the following: autobiography is only to be trusted when it reveals something disgraceful. A man who gives a good account of himself is probably lying, since any life, when viewed from inside, is simply a series of defeats.
Can people hear me? That could be true, and I was thinking, when we had the question on the prior panel about can an archive damage an artwork. I immediately had this thought of a moment when I looked at an archive and I thought, my God, does the world need to know how petty this person was? how petty this person was, and that, you know, sometimes there are very negative things that might be in there. Quite often those things do get removed, and I often see it live. People going through behind you and scrubbing a little clean. You know, that definitely happens. It's funny that he says man, because I see that, it's a generalization, but I see that way more with men than women.
Men lying more.
Men removing. Men removing. And far more often, it is the women artists who want every bad thing to be remembered.
Any thoughts about that from you and from others? I'm curious.
Well, I think because so often that adversity becomes a part of the story. That is the thing that you're fighting against, that you're having to work harder, you're having to do more with resources that are less. And for that to go away, you know, it will have been removed what so much of your time is spent on.
Well, also, Kathleen Hanna chose to keep her terrible college artwork in her archive as a way to show other young people that you can be a terrible disaster at some things and it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Student work is a huge or childhood work also. I think at the Getty, a lot of our women artists archives start with childhood and sort of seeing what people were interested in and then how it grew. And then in other cases, you know, we have artists who, until they've decided they have arrived, there's nothing until that point, as if it just sort of sprang forward. That's all fine. You know, you are in control of your archive. You can make those choices. There's not, you know, I don't mean it to sound judgmental that people do this or that, because it is a representational medium, no matter what the decisions are. But, you know, I think it's very easy when you're a researcher to think that there might be a little bit of continuity from one archive to another, and they're all completely different. So you kind of have to start from where each one begins.
I just feel like I have to intercede and say, I don't know, maybe 12 years ago I did a show at Phillips called Precocious Minor Archives from the Phillips Library. Everything was done by people before the age of 19. And I think, Martha, you had a bunch of cat drawings in there, didn't you?
A lot of cats.
Any thoughts from you, the difference between
I
men and
think
women?
the value of my personal archives is that I didn't know who the hell I was. And I wrote it all down as I was going through the process of figuring out who the hell I was. And I don't know if that's lying or not, but it's whatever, you know, whatever was in there I tried to get down on the page.
I know this is supposed to be Glenn's section, but I just have a lot to say about diaries. Because an experience I had with a certain famous slash writer, where we were sitting down to lunch, and there was someone in our archives, and he said, I said, you know, nobody that I'm working with the Riot Girl collection is donating their journals, obviously. And he said, obviously? I mean, I want all my journals in my archive because I always knew that I was going to be very famous. And so it was this, to me, also seemed like a gendered thing. Like he saw his journals as this like evidence of his genius, whereas these other women who were young and on the writing side is kind of this private space of just like figuring out who they were.
But obviously we're only in control while we're alive. Because the archive afterwards will be used and...
Well, unless you burn it all, you know, or you don't. remove the portions that you don't want to go down. I think diaries are particularly strange because artists rarely come back to them, or whoever keeps them rarely come back to them. You kind of write it and you keep going, but then once it goes into an institution, other people start reading them. So I've had the weird case when working with an artist where, with Yvonne Rainer when I was working on her retrospective, I read her diaries from elementary school, to the latest ones that we had, and then found myself in these weird situations like, no, Yvonne, that was the second time you took LSD. Don't you remember the first time?
It's wonderful.
This strange bit where someone's life can rub off on you in a way that's really more immediate than it might be for them today. And so that is a decision. If you want material like that to be available, what I always tell people is, yes, you can include that. The thing you have to keep in mind is whatever you include, people will use. And that's the level of comfort.
And in many ways, you become the palliative memory. You are remembering by being so much in their lives things that they have forgotten.
If you're the one who's been reading it, it's a very strange situation to get to that point in your life.
Yes. Before we go to Martha's presentation, I will simply say I was reminded over lunch telling Glenn this story that I used to work at the New York Public Library, and they ran a program called Live from the New York Public Library. And my father decided at one point that I needed to become practical. And so he gave me a subscription to The Economist. And 2 years later, I told him, he asked me how I liked The Economist, and I said I love the obituaries. And he started to despair again. And we did a program at the library called Live from the New York Public Library Presents Dead from the New York Public Library, where I invited the obituary writer of The Economist, very hard to find because they're not signed, but I did find her finally, Anne Rowe, a great specialist of Shelley. And I invited several undertakers of the New York Times to come, like William Grimes and others. And Anne said, I hope my subjects die on a certain day because then I have 5 days to write the obituary. The New York Times didn't have that problem because they have 14,000 people ready to go. But one of the things that William Grimes said, which I'll never forget, was that he often had lunch or dinner or drinks, depending on how well his subjects were doing, with his subjects. And I don't know if they were men or women, but each one of them desperately tried to improve their life, desperately tried to improve their obituary, the very thing they will never read. And that thought of trying to, in a way, reinvent another life is very interesting. I think particularly when archivists are trying to interpret that life. Martha, the floor is yours.
So everybody in this room knows that Futurism was announced on the front page of the Figaro by Marinetti. But I believe Futurism is also the source of the ephemeral practice called performance art. Frank Furness tries to preserve this ephemeral practice of performance art. So I'm going to start with the Venice Futurist pamphlet. It was a flyer. The Futurists published hundreds of thousands of copies of this flyer. This is the French version. I don't have the Italian version. Basically, it says, no, I should back up. Then the Futurists in 1910, a year after Futurism had been announced, gathered at the clock tower of the Piazza San Marco in Venice, waited for people to come out of church. Then they started throwing these hundreds of thousands of copies of this flyer out of the heads of the people. And they read, the Italians read, Venice worships the past, but only the future has value, so it should be allowed to sink into the Adriatic Sea. Well, the futurist poets and painters were at the top of the clock tower. The townspeople were at the bottom of the clock tower. They both went into the stairwell, and they had a fist fight in the stairwell. This is, to me, this is my theory, the beginning of performance art. Now we are decades later. Jenny Holzer's Truisms is in the front window of Franklin First. I started an arts organization because I was making artist books, and I had 30 friends and they were making artist books and nobody was paying any attention. This is Lower Manhattan in the 70s. The city was going bankrupt, so they didn't pay any attention to us. And we were developing posters, Barbara Kruger was putting posters on the street, Christy Rupp was putting posters on the curbs for the rap population of New York. Artists were doing ephemeral things that were unsaleable. So Mike Glear is on the ladder, taking a picture of our plate glass window, which got broken by a guy who driving by threw a bolt through the window. The bolt went through the truism. Boredom makes you do crazy things. So I started collecting what we now call artist books. I don't think we had that term in the beginning. I didn't know what to call them. They're works of art that require the time to turn the pages, so it's an interactive process. This is Klaus Oldenburg's More Ray Gun Poems, published in 1960 on paper left over from Judson Memorial Church announcements, and then stapled, the binding, there is no binding, it's just a couple of staples. He tried to give them away. People basically threw them in the trash, so the few that remain are valuable. Ida Appelbrug, this artist book is called Stop Crying, but all of her artist books have the subtitle, A Performance, all of her works. She thought about the turning of the pages, and some of the pages are blank and some of the text, there are images on some of the pages on this text. Very simple and profound. I think all of her books are profound. This is an artist book. It's a collection of condoms, and it's called Obscene Is by Daniel Martinez, published. The story is because I wanted to the art was not a new, really art for quite a long time. Curated by Yaroslav Andel, 1900 to 1945. Apollinaire's poetry is on the wall. This is Eldazitsky and Vladimir Mayakovsky with a visual index along the right side. The right, like a phone book or like a dictionary. The Green Box by Marcel Duchamp. Bulletin Dada. This is Artist's Call Against U.S. Intervention in Central America. And an artist once asked me if his work had to be political to be shown by Franklin Furnace. And the answer is it has to be, real, it has to be relevant to what you are thinking about. There were thousands of artists in cities all over the country who were protesting Ronald Reagan's decision to basically intervene in the political processes of Central America. This couldn't be happening today, do you think? So Franklin Furnace was one of multiple organizations in New York and 27 cities across the country that participated in the Artist's Call Against U.S. Intervention in Central America. This is our Samizdat show. Samizdat is Russian stuff that was produced in private because otherwise you would get thrown in jail. Dara Birnbaum's A Banner as Billboard Reading versus Reading Into 1978. I like this because it shows Lower Manhattan, which is a pretty rough place in the 70s. And she used she used the transom above the door and the front window, and then also the transom above the co-op door next door to us. Using the front of the building as a broadcast medium. Robert Wilson is reading a text from Letter to Queen Victoria. It's the word there, 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 there. I would say 250 times. I don't really know the answer to how many times. Jill Scott having herself masking taped to the wall. Ana Mendieta's Body Tracks. The paint is made of tempera and cow's blood. Susan Mogul doing the dishes. Baby Icky. Michael Smith, the birthday party for Baby Icky. Nelson Mandela. This piece by Willie Cole is called 10,000 Mandelas. Nelson Mandela had been in solitary for a quarter of a century at this point. There's an audio component. So, as passers-by are going to the courthouses down Franklin Street, they're hearing Mandela, 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 Mandela. Tina Keene is in the playpen. She has a camera pointed at the audience, so the audience is also in the playpen. We invited Suzanne Lacey from Los Angeles and Susan Hiller, who was living in London, to invite performance artists from Los Angeles and performance artists from London to meet in New York and then do their work and watch each other practicing. What was interesting to me about this whole LA-London lab experience was the artists from California sat in each other's labs and collaborated in each other's work, and the artists from England were, individualistic and had to be strong, and do their own work and not interact with other people. Peggy Diggs on no installation preparators. Angelica Vanke Festa, Heloise's bird, she hung for 24 hours on a flagpole. Sherman Fleming and Christine Stiles, Western History as a 3-story building. Terry Ito, Memory of the Epidermis, she made a sheet of skin out of paper. The Blue Man Group. Popel, How Much Is That Nigger in the Window, 1991. He's wearing jockey shorts, sitting in our front window, right on Franklin Street. And he smears mayonnaise on his skin in an effort to become white. But of course it oxidizes and he just becomes very shiny. Julie Lafine, Various States of Dress. When you come in the gallery, the floor is covered with fabric. It turns out to be a dress. It's about 70 feet long. And she gets into a cab and disappears. Dolores Arrieta, Wounds. These are thigh-sized sculptures covered with band-aids. It's about the disappeared of Argentina. She's Argentinian. Yvette Terline, Pedestrian Project. So we were merrily rolling along until 1984 when we did we accepted a proposal from 9 women artists and activists who asked if there could be such a thing as feminist pornography. And one of the performances was Deep Inside Porn Stars with Annie Sprinkle, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 from the left. You can barely see her, but that's Annie Sprinkle. She made her debut as a performance artist at this event. She decided being a prostitute it's okay, but I'd rather be a performance artist. Here's the front window. This is the performance Deep Inside Porn Stars where they moon the audience. We also had Jennifer Miller and Susan Sizer doing mud wrestling upstairs. And then the Morality Action Committee decided that, they were smart about it. This is a Christian group. They waited till the show had been deinstalled. Then they wrote postcards to all of our funders claiming that Franklin Furnace had shown pornography to 500 children per day. Karen Finley is one of the NEA 4. This is her show in 1990. She made the case that she had emerged as a performance artist, but she had not emerged as an installation artist. So this is these are slides of her installation at Franklin Furnace called "A Woman's Life Isn't Worth Much." I'm going to leave it there. The end. Thank you.
So excited to be here. I love to talk about archives, and it's hard sometimes to rein in all the experiences I've been privileged to have and all the ideas I have around archives. I do want to say that when I hear a term like the politics of absence, what is omitted, I think of actually all of the people who have been omitted from decades and decades of exclusionary collecting. And of course, the situation we're in right now, where the very work that we're doing is completely threatened economically and by our own government. So normally, I would probably give a talk like I normally do about sort of how we in the past may have tried to account for the gaps in collecting, maybe the savior mentality that kind of represented when curators and curators in large institutions were deciding on behalf of others what to collect, how that makes community archives kind of a example for like an autonomous model of archiving. And in my op-ed, I kind of talk about, ultimately people should have a choice of whether they want to be part of an institutional collection or self-archive, but that as long as there's no funding or support, it's not really a choice. However, today I'm going to talk about something that might seem a little more abstract, but I think kind of ends up by asking some of the same questions. And the point of this talk really is just to raise questions for conversation. So between 2008 and 2016, I was the senior archivist at the Phillips Library and Special Collections, working with performance artists, many of the people we just saw, theater people, writers, activists, to preserve their archives. And of course, because of that period of time, downtown New York, 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, the sort of things we collected were often challenging to archival practice, and often were things that other traditional archives might not have even taken on. So what I wanted to talk about specifically is kind of the case study of objects in archives and like how they might function. So as I was being trained as an archivist between 2006 and 2008 at NYU, we were taught to always think about what is research value and to only take things into the archives that have research value. And so I started to think about what kind of research value do non-textual objects have. Something like this, David Wojnarowicz's stencils, you might be able to make an argument that it served a function in art making practice. Maybe it makes sense to keep it in the archive. Then you have something like this, a suitcase that one of the Royal collections came into the collection with, and we kept the suitcase as well. It's got text all over it. Maybe it's a textual document. Or David Wojnarowicz's wolf head, again a textual object, but also something that showed up in installations. It was in Rosa von Braunheim's Silence Equals Death documentary, so it had a multiple life in his artworks. And then something maybe a little more intangible, this is the back panel of Abram Finkelstein's leather jacket. He was a founder of ACT UP and Grand Fury, so you might recognize this iconography from their poster, The Government Has Blood on Its Hands. And then just quickly, something that we had in our collections was several pairs of eyeglasses, all from artists who had died young from complications from HIV. And to me, that's kind of the ultimate test case of what is value, right? So while they're alive, it's a prescription that's specific to a living human. Once they die, there's no context for them anymore. But as an effective object, they obviously have a lot of power. But if I have time, my plan is to talk very quickly about the specific case of the magic box. This you start to recognize some of its in terms of what how they've been described practically, but at the same time wrote an essay for Archivaria that approaches the questions more conceptually, like how can an object be a document, or how does an archival object change over time in terms of its context or who inscribes it. But actually the most interesting thing about the Magic Box, some of you may know, is that at this time, before I started, the curators had decided not to preserve the contents of the box. So things were going to be put back in the box, left exactly how they were, not individually housed. And this is why it was even more important for me to do the cataloging and description of work, because that was going to be the only way to preserve it, and the idea is there would be less access. But ultimately, these objects would rub up against each other, off gas on each other, and very quickly disappear. So the Magic Box has continued to exert a lot of fascination. In 2014, Julie Alt exhibited at the Whitney Biennial. Somebody even made a little facsimile set of playing cards out of them. And I do know as well that the box at Fails continues to be kind of almost like a ritual encounter object, that people go there to have an encounter with the box and then have an encounter with David, which is something I'm really interested in and wrote kind of more about in the booklet, is that way we can feel we know an artist through their archive. But the reason that I'm kind of coming back to it, because this is a 17-year-old project for me personally, is that some younger archivists came to me and said they were fans of the essay that I wrote then, which shocked me, because they didn't know any review about it. But also let me know that the decision has now been made to take everything out and individually house it for obvious reasons, so that it will be permanently preserved. So I'm kind of agnostic. I'm not here to say one thing's better than the other. It's more to pose some questions. And not only the questions I discussed, but also a few that I want to leave us with, like, I forgot a really important part of what I was going to say. So, I was doing this very detailed description of each item at a time when the profession was very influenced by MPLP. How many people know what MPLP is? Yes, more project, less process. It was a way for archivists to address these massive backlogs that we had in our institutional collections by being less fussy and describing them with less detail. That's the short version. And so at the same time, and I was very pro MPLP, I'm doing this task that is minutely describing things that other people would have thought was garbage. So it just represents the larger question of why do some artists get so much minute, resources, and other artists are not getting any help at all. This is a theoretical question in many ways, like, we work so hard to preserve every little thing as a way to preserve the artist, but aren't there some cases where an absence is a more accurate representation of the artist's disappearance? And then the last question, which is a multi-part question, is who decides? The artist's dead, they can't have a contribution to what happens, but also, is it even my place or the curators before me place to make a decision like that, even though they worked with the executor? Those are my questions for now.
So let's try to answer the second and third question. It's interesting. What is the best way to document that?
I'm not agnostic. May I respond? I fully respect any institution's ability to make its own decisions, but I have a personal point of view here that, when you take the contents of a box like that and you pull them all out, and you individually house them and wrap them and separate them and protect them. You have pre-murdered the object.
You have pre-murdered.
Pre-murdered the object under the guise of saving it, because never again can a person actually experience what that box was. You have dissected it and you know, removed it, and that experience cannot be had anymore. And I think we really, as you know, our job is preservation, but I think part of preservation is becoming comfortable with the idea of further loss. Because the things that you do that avoid the sort of wear of an object that is meant to receive wear, you've removed that experience that could have been had. Nobody can ever have the experience again. So we actually murdered it now.
The truth is, I'm not agnostic either. And I just want to add to that, I think it also kind of destroys a community. Like, I mean, archives is all about context.
Yeah.
And these things have meaning because they're together in the way they interact with each other. So it's not just the experience, but the relationship between the objects.
Yeah. So we have to get more comfortable with that idea that everything is temporary. All those photographs. I've had object that can be accessed exactly once. The only way is to destroy them. And so what do you do? And the decision I've made is I will never tell anyone what those objects are. But when the day comes that there's a person that says, I need to destroy this object in order to experience this object because my research is that important, I will say yes.
I know you don't want to reveal those objects, but could you describe one such instance where that happened?
Imagine it's something that is encased in such a way that in order to know what's inside of it, you have to fully destroy it in a way that can never be repaired. So that can be an example. You know, I think we would probably ask the person to agree to be filmed, you know, when they're opening it. But otherwise, what are we preserving? And particularly, you know, quite often these are artworks, and they're experiential artworks. And so, you know, you can let someone experience it once as intended, or 0 times, in which case, what have you done? And so, you know, I just think we have to increase our comfort level with having loss be part of the process, because it's there anyway. It's just normally happening so slowly over time that we can't watch it ourselves.
When you save the remains, after the box is destroyed or whatever.
Yeah, you save the remains, but then it's you know, God, I missed it, didn't I? For everybody else. So at least somebody should get to do it. And I think, you know, something like the Magic Box, yes, they'll grade each other an off-gas. Over years and years and years, but people still could have been experiencing it the way that it was designed to be.
So what would either of you have done with the Magic Box?
I think they did it right the first time. Yeah. I mean, we have this situation at you know, we have extensive fluxus collections where a prior, and you know, things change over time. So a prior philosophy of preservation would have said, house these little bitty, all these little bitty things in the box individually. And so now these objects are basically useless to get everything out. You're actually handling it more if you ever try to put it back together. The chance of damage is the chance of trying to get it out of a little plastic bag. Like that's way more dangerous than it bumping up against itself. And you know, but it's most of that housing still remains because it can be a huge process to go back and do it again. But then in other cases, you know, we have kind of gone back, or if something goes into an exhibition and then redo it all, then you kind of rehoused at the point that it comes back. So there's this kind of archaeology of different philosophies of conservation that you can see, when you pulled something and when it was cataloged. And so, the next generation is going to realize everything we're doing wrong now. It all sort of changes. So you do whatever is best for you at the time. I think you have to be open to criticism, and then you have to at least really believe the decisions that you made and why. And if you can do that, then I think you also did it right, even if it's completely different than what I'm saying I believe in right now.
This leads me to a question, which is, you talk about philosophies of preservation. Over time, what made you change your philosophy of what needed to be preserved and how? And this is a question for all of you.
I mean, maybe it makes sense for me to start because the thing that immediately comes to mind is when I wrote this essay, I was still just a student. So I was like, all objects should be individually cataloged, they deserve it, they're important. Then a few months later, I became the head of this department, and I remember sitting in there and looking at the thousands and thousands and thousands of objects and the tens of thousands of linear feet of unprocessed archives, and I said, oh,
Maybe not.
I can choose to catalog this Richard Hell's poop in a jar, that's another story, and not catalog Linda Montana's journals, or I can, so I think there's a reality of the enormity of what needs to be taken care of, and I don't think that exactly answered the question, but it was kind of a category change.
Another way of asking the same question, when were you wrong?
Probably now. But then I was looking through years worth of correspondence between Zijian and James and Byers, and I opened this letter that turned out to basically be a glitter bomb. He would fill letters, and thank God, well, there's almost nothing more insidious on this planet for an archive or a video camera than glitter. One thing worse, he also had made some that were filled with pure red pigment, and that is certainly worse. This experience of glitter flying everywhere because I just sort of opened the letter. In a way it's a disaster, but it was so beautiful. And and in Zijian's case, James and Byers was writing them so often that he stopped opening the letters. And so we have dozens of these letters that have never been opened. And so there aren't that many left in the world where you can actually experience this. Right? Of course, we don't want that to happen in the middle of a clean room. But I had the experience and then realized, okay, so it was by chance, I didn't know, but it was a wonderful thing. And so why should we take that away from the ones that are rough, even if they are like little time bombs? And there was no situation where I'm going to start tweezing glitter to put it back, right? But it's, I think, being reminded that because we're thinking about these things as archive, as evidence, as document, but quite often they are mail art, they are artist books, they are time-based experiences, they're time-delayed experiences, and there's not a strict separation between what is art and what is archive. They're always kind of intertwined, and the best practices for one might collide with the best practices for the other, and you have to make decisions.
asked the talent on stage to provide me with questions that they might ask of you. And I love this question that Lisa is asking you, Martha. We processed your personal papers at Phillips. What was it like to be on the other side of that equation after so many years of collecting and archiving other archives?
A lot of personal shit. The abortion, we discussed abortion stories. This relates back to a comment about the difference between male archives and female archives. I think, as I said, I was trying to figure out who was in there because my parents, my boyfriends, whatever, had influenced my teachers on my thinking, but I didn't know what I thought about, did I want to live in a messy house or a clean house? I don't know, let's try it out and see. So the archive, for me, the diaries, are a way to track the internal processes that are going on. I'm finding out too, as I'm writing it down.
Well, I think that it's true that when we were processing your archive, we found a pregnancy test.
Yes.
And I called you up and asked you, because your archive is unusually comprehensive, shall we say.
Unusually comprehensive.
And so some people maybe would have taken a lot more out before they had given it to us. But I just wanted to make sure in this case that this should, stay. You said absolutely it must stay. It's part of the story.
Yeah.
Lisa, there is one sentence you love, which started you thinking for a long time, and perhaps in closing you could unpack it for us. It's a sentence from Archive Fever of Getty, where he says, how can the person who promises a secret to a ghost still dare say he or she is a historian?
Okay, sorry, I have to get over my fear of you asking me about Derrida. Because I just reread that article about the magic box that I wrote 20 years ago or whatever, and I was like, oh, I wrote a lot about Derrida, I forgot. But no, this is a completely different line that I just completely decontextualized from its origin. And I think it was I think I read it 2006 or something before I truly even knew what the work of an archivist was going to be. And I had this very strong sense that I already felt this indebtedness and sense of responsibility towards the dead author or the dead artist. That not only was a responsibility, but felt kind of exciting. Like we have a secret together. But that makes it even more pressure on me to represent.
Which I love, saying you yourself want to disappear.
At the end of this, have parts of institutions where decisions have changed based on who is there. It kind of makes me wonder what the role of the curator or the archivist is. If with each person, if the decisions are so tied to an individual. I don't know, what does that say? And then also, shouldn't the people who created the archives, or the communities that created the archives, really be the ones who are deciding? Of course, in many cases, people are dead, and that's not a possibility. But if they were funded properly to have institutions that represented themselves, then it wouldn't even be kind of an issue. That's, to me, this idea of kind of the disappearance of the need for me as a curator, I guess.
It reminded me of a wonderful line of Nick Tosches, who said, I wanted to be alone, not forgotten. Well, with that in mind, we'll take questions, the really only good ones.
choose not to include in their archive for many different reasons. And Lisa talked about curators being tasked to decide what has research value and deciding, oh, we're not going to take this, we're going to take that. And then wondering, I think the absence seems to me that sometimes might become even more interesting because it's been omitted, and so I'm just wondering if what happens to it. Does it get thrown away, or does it sometimes show up years later in different forms?
A lot can happen. I mean, the most extreme case, this year, I watched an artist rip something to pieces right in front of me because I asked him about it. And it wasn't something I wanted, and so that can happen. What's more common is it goes to the family or it goes to the estate and they make a decision about it later. And that decision could be that it's preserved in the estate and people can look at it there. It can be that nobody can look at it. Or sometimes it comes to market. You know, you'll find it with this gallerist or this auction. And sometimes it gets lost.
Sometimes it ends in the trash.
Oh yeah.
Mary Beth Ellison was archived, but not everything, nor bags of stuff on the sidewalk. And people rooting through it, looking for stuff, but it was trash.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not exactly what you asked, but that was really the pressure when I was collecting, is that there was so much good stuff that needed a home that we could not take everything, and so that knowing that the decision often was we don't take it or it goes in the trash is a very heartbreaking decision to make, and so we try to find other ways of preserving them, and that's why we need more support and money. So that, because maybe you are not famous enough to join the Getty archive, but there could be another kind of archive that's for another kind of art practice.
Thank you very much. So this question was coming from the early session in the morning and advanced this time. And I realized I am in the process of murdering myself in the transition
I'm so sorry that this is happening here.
which is a good way to move into a new studio by destroying something that's going to the trash, may helping you later on if it goes to any of the archives. So the question was, from morning, Randy was talking about shaped by intentionality of preserving artists' archives. So I am pretty much choosing what to keep and what to destroy. But I noticed from Lisa's examples, those are all things that I throw out. So the question now becomes, for example, after my last day, and you guys receiving an artist kind of a bunch of stuff, some digital and some physical. What do you do? What do you sort? And what is something that you would like to discover and get into first? And it would be maybe for everybody. Thank you.
I mean, I'm not sure this is exactly your question, but I mean, we do appraisal, which is different than monetary appraisal. So we do have guidelines in mind for what does or doesn't fall into the purviews of our collecting. And my talk was kind of to show that how those parameters can go really widely. But in terms of, are you imagining a scenario where you didn't prepare in advance, or?
Throwing things away.
Yeah.
But I would hear your process of working with artist archives. What do you see? What do you do when you receive an artist archive?
I mean, normally and I'm not in this position anymore, I should add, so Glenn, you're maybe better off than me, but it would be a conversation with the artists if they're living in the state of they're living. So there's a lot of visits, and this is the way I used to do it, right, Glenn, I'm sure it's the same with you, right? There's lots and lots of conversations and looking at the stuff together. I feel like this stuff is so important to play a role in that conversation because if it's hypothetical, it never quite makes sense. So for me, it's just lots and lots of conversations about, because you can't tell something just without the person there, what its function served, what it meant, how it related to the rest of the archive. You need the human there to kind of tell you what that meaning was and to document that meaning.
It's different for every person, and it's different for every institution. There's not a universal collecting policy. And so what one place might say yes to, another would say that's out of scope for us. Like a frequent, will you take, this hat was very important to me, then you should keep it.
Have you said that?
Yeah. But that's, I think, because at my institution, our vaults are optimized for paper more than textiles. And our staffing is also optimized for paper more than textiles. And so, in the cases of textiles, we do have, we're usually having to look for outside expertise. One, there are other reasons as well. Or quite often, let's say someone's record collection is really a portrait of them, but with copyright law being the way it is, a library cannot do much with commercial music. We can't really make it available in a way that sits well with record companies. And so we can't really do much with that stuff, except we could inventory it, and there could be a list, that's available. I think that in the end, try to keep what you can. If you truly feel it's of no value to you, it's okay. We don't have to have the standard of the person who never threw anything away as the ultimate goal. It's amazing that such archives exist, but I can tell you, because I've known a lot of those people, they might have had an easier life if they didn't. Because imagine, here's our narrative, a normal narrative, you live your life, you have your career, and then the time comes when you downsize, right? Imagine you can't. Imagine it's only ever getting to be more. You only always ever need more space. You only ever always have to be taking care of more things that are becoming more fragile and more difficult. It never gets less. It only gets worse. Every single day of your life until you finally reach the point that it goes to a repository. Because every collection that you encounter like that, that's what that person went through. That's what their life was. Most cannot have that experience. Most of us have that situation where, okay, I have to move into a smaller place because I can't afford it anymore. What am I going to get rid of?
Or there's no more space.
Or there's no more space. Or there's no more space. So that is a totally valid thing that happens way more often than the uninterrupted line of custody from day one until it finally goes into the institution. So there's no reason to feel worse that you have to make those decisions. And the fact of the matter, almost every artist I've ever met, they're more interested in what they're working on now than what they were doing in 1981. So if they're having to prioritize, they're going to prioritize what allows me to do my work now, and that's okay too.
Can I hop in, please?
It's not on the Just like a very small anecdote for your question is, there's an artist, Christopher D'Arcangelo, whose papers were at Phillips, and his practice was very importantly involved saving receipts for things he bought at hardware stores for each performative action that he took. And so it'd be like, $1.17 on a piece of paper. And so everybody else was kind of telling me, you gotta throw those away, they're receipts, but it's intrinsic to his practice. So you can see that there's no way to have a manual that tells you what does and doesn't belong in your artist's archive.
This must resonate for you, Martha, because your mother taught you a lesson.
My mother is a Quaker. The Quakers never throw anything away. They pass it on to the next generation.
And
And
then,
they pass it on to the next generation. And I have 300-year-old blankets in my possession at home. But I started an arts organization that saves everything. And so it kind of, it's a life story. And I haven't told you this. Amy Baker, who was one of the founders of Art Forum magazine, was on my board of directors. She said, "Martha, hire a damn archivist."
Hi there. Thank you all so much for this talk. I was just curious, in your work as archivists and managing archives and creating them, how has this impacted your personal practice? You kind of alluded to this, Marta, like caring for family heirlooms over, and passed down. I was curious how this impacts your personal lives as well, because I work in a library, actually at NYU, and it's something that I'm constantly thinking of now, because every day is a decision about what to keep and what not to keep, and I'd just like to hear all from you.
Well, the very first thing that happened to me is I started dating my diaries and things that I wrote, because I was driven crazy as I was processing other people's things, and I was like, is this from 1920 or is it sometimes there's contextual clues, okay, whatever. So that was the first thing to start actually treating my own papers as historical documents in a way. But I actually use my journals. Somebody said that never happens. Was that you, Glenn? Or someone earlier? That no one ever goes back and reads their journals. I do it constantly. So I don't know if I would do that if I wasn't an archivist.
you're plundering the sense.
And I'm always delighted and surprised by it was you that said it. That I was so much smarter than, or stupider than, or that I ever thought this thing, or that I'm thinking the same thing over and over and over again and thinking it's a new idea.
I want to echo thanks for sharing your insights and your experiences. I'm curious to know if you, given how you've been discussing aspects of finiteness, if you can foresee more institutions getting into the archive preservation arena in the future. No. And or maybe the flip side of that question, what is the current landscape for these institutions? Is it do you foresee the number shrinking? Is that a fait accompli?
No, but I'm very afraid that it's maybe going to be less. If not less institutions, maybe less activity, because everywhere is out of space. To me, it's the crisis that most institutions don't want to talk about it because it feels like a failing. And so my feeling is I'm telling everybody, because we're out of space at the Getty, we're not collecting archives right now. We're waiting for more storage. And if it can happen to us, it can happen to others. And in fact, it has happened to others. And the way you'll recognize it is you'll start to hear, when you're trying to talk with someone about something, you'll start to hear this kind of circular language that tells you no in a different way. Because I think most institutions would rather try to find a way to solve it behind the scenes. But there's almost nothing more expensive and energy hungry than climate-controlled, secure storage. And in many cases, if you're out of space, then you're looking for another location, which means another building, it needs another set of staff, it needs another set of bills. We're maybe not, decisions like that happen when we're in an optimistic time, when the market is an optimistic time. And so I don't know that these two problems are lining up in exactly the right way right now. And so there's probably less future activity, at least that's the direction where I think it's headed now. And maybe that'll be just temporary over the next few years, but I think that all this stuff, it's maybe disappeared from the artist studio, but it's accumulating somewhere else. And, you know.
I mean, those aren't the only options, right? So, like, just maybe this is, you know, not only is it the time of community archives and the way that community archives have modeled for us, like, you know, a more autonomous and you know, archiving model, but also it will just be out of necessity to create like community-supported repositories because there's not going to be any other kind of support. I mean, the Getty is a bit of a unique situation, but the universities are under attack, and the nonprofits are under attack. It's going to be people like Martha who I think keeps his collections cared for. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think if there's ever been more of a need for a community-based solution, you know, it's probably now. But that means you all have to do it.
Sure.
I mean, just to continue that, should I wait for the?
Just to continue that question, because it also connects to where we left our conversation this morning. I think, you know, one aspect of that is that people don't realize the amount of, you know, money and care and concern that a collection entails when you take it on. Oftentimes institutions now are actually asking for an endowment or something to be able to process that material. But more importantly, I'm wondering if thinking about, can you give some examples of institutions that are doing this on a community level, that are doing this in an experimental way? Are there, you know, groups of archives, or are there examples of things that you're seeing being done that are responding to this moment? So yeah, so many. Just one is 60 inches from center, Chicago Archives, so I always get it wrong. Chicago Artists Archives Project, I might have flipped those around, has done all sorts of interesting work. For example, pairing community archives with artists and residencies. They also used to have yearly archives festivals where they would have a information booth where people from the community could come in with questions, almost like Antiques Roadshow, and they would just help give them advice. Something like Transfer Station, that's just going to help you preserve your AV tapes. I think there's a lot of incredible work like that happening. It's just kind of gonna, we're gonna have to let go of some of our perfectionism in terms of what constitutes a preserved or cataloged item, and we're gonna also just have to redirect our energies into supporting those groups with our skills if we have them.
One last question, Ross, do you want to ask?
Thank you. Just based on this morning and this title too, I'm getting the impression that an archivist is a very particular kind of person, that there must be something very specific about you that you realize about yourself, or something within you that makes you choose this path, or that makes you find such pleasure or obsession.
It's called compulsion.
So that's my question, is whether there is something you can identify that it's not just anybody who would choose to take on these sorts of Sisyphean kind of tasks, and these very, very minute and incredibly detail-oriented, and it seems like everybody speaking has a very, very intense fascination and obsession and pleasure in doing so. I'm curious where that comes from, if you have any idea.
Before Glenn answers that question, Martha, can you elaborate on
Anal compulsion? Some people keep track of stuff. My partner, for example, has kept the program from every single theater piece he's ever seen since 1983. And he keeps them in annual sets and chronologically within the annual sets, and he's got little placards that say this is 1984 and this is 1985. And he uses it. He goes back to his theater. I think if we're arguing about when was the last time we saw Eric Bogosian, he'll just go to his files and tell me the answer.
I think it's all different types of people. I think in my case, I have had a little bit of an agenda because as an art historian, what I'm interested in the most is the ephemeral. So it is video art, it is performance art, it is site-specific projects that are temporary, it is instructions, it is all of this huge amount of activity that I think has been so generative for so many other types of art making, yet it is the least represented in our museums. And when it is represented, it's often in an archival way. And unsatisfactory, because you're just getting a little sort of snippet or something. And so, and that's for the modern and contemporary collections at the Getty Research Institute. We focus mostly on that. And so it's been a way that I can kind of carve out a safe place for my field. When the museums, you're always getting a little crumb here and there. And we can sort of make it be one of the central things that we do and preserve it for other historians to learn from.
For me, I thought, I'm an introvert, what a great profession where I just sit in a basement and just commune with documents all day. Very quickly decided that that was a nightmare job. And what I really love about this job is people. Like I see it's the people that matter, it's the relationships between me and people that are alive, the people that are dead, the relationships between the archives themselves. And also, even though I'm very messy and disorganized individually, it's more for me a desire to be like accurate and represent these people's wishes or selves in a way that feels, I don't know, Glenn, when you said something like you felt like you were failing everybody, I feel like I've had that feeling a lot institutionally, like you want to kind of do it right for everybody and have a strong impulse to do that.
I find it so interesting to also think about the difference between collecting and hoarding. Collecting. What do you mean exactly? And I'm often reminded of one of the ways in Latin to talk about possession, which is impedimenta. So there are moments when there's just too much stuff. And I suppose that's when you come in.
That's when people hope that's when we come in. When we actually come in.
On this notion of hope, thank you very much.